Hey guys, welcome to part 3 in my makeup declutter series. Today I'm going to be going through my entire eyeshadow palette collection, which at this moment consists of over 100 palettes. I counted about 110, so I have quite a few to get through. I just really want to curate my entire makeup collection in general, but I definitely have a lot of eyeshadow palettes, maybe more than any other category in my makeup collection. But any palettes that I declutter, I am going to be giving to friends and family. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so here is my entire eyeshadow palette collection. I went ahead and put them into boxes and plastic containers just to have it all here in front of me. So I'm just gonna focus on one of these at a time. I'm gonna go ahead and start with this one over here. So I do have 4 palettes from Wet n Wild. This one is the Not a Basic Peach palette, and this one I honestly don't care for. I've never liked this formula. I would say the mattes are definitely better than the shimmers, and the shimmers are just very lackluster, so I'm going to declutter this one. This one I am keeping, however. This one is very pigmented. I just haven't used it in a really long time, and because it is Pac-Man, I need to keep this one. And unfortunately, the container did break already, so it is a little bit on the cheap side when it comes to the packaging, but these eyeshadows actually blend really well. The mattes are super pigmented and the shimmers are really pretty as well, so I am definitely keeping this one. I'm gonna go ahead and declutter these two, however. This one was from the Peanuts and Wet n Wild collection, and I did play with it a few times. I'm pretty sure I tried every single shadow in here, and I just didn't like the quality. A lot of the mattes are really dusty and just not very pigmented, and you can't really build them up. The glitters are pretty, but I just don't see the point in keeping this when I don't like this palette overall. So I'm gonna declutter this one. And then the Coffee Cap palette. This is such a cute palette, but I really only like the mattes in here and maybe like one of the shimmers. I think the only shimmer that really worked for me was this one. So I'm gonna declutter this one. All right, I have some more drugstore palettes. So let me go through those. And over here I have some Morphe palettes. I'll go through those after these. So I already know that I'm gonna keep this one from e.l.f. This is the e.l.f. times Chipotle eyeshadow palette. This was such a good palette, and just like the collection overall, I really enjoyed, but the quality of this palette is so good. I wish e.l.f. would stick to more of this formula in particular, because this one is very pigmented. I love the way that these shadows blend, and the shimmers are really, really pretty. Especially this one right here. This is like a duochrome shade. That is super pretty. Yeah, definitely one of my favorite palettes from e.l.f. And then this one is the e.l.f. times J Kissa To The Rescue eyeshadow palette. This one I'm thinking of letting go simply because I never use it. This is a super colorful eyeshadow palette, so I never reach for it, and I definitely prefer other formulas when it comes to colorful eyeshadows. Some of the mattes you do have to build up, and the shimmers, some of them already created hard pan, so I'm gonna let this one go actually, as adorable as it is. I like that it came with stickers. I did decorate the front, but I think it's time to let it go. This one is the Maybelline Nudes of New York palette. This one I thought was just okay. I wasn't a big fan of this eyeshadow formula. It's very like subdued, so you can't really build up these shades much. The shimmers aren't very punchy either, so if you like more of a natural or neutral look, you might like this palette, but I definitely think you can find better ones at the drugstore or just like from more affordable brands. So I think I'm gonna let this one go. The Milani Pure Passion palette. I have not used this one in years, but it used to be one of my go-to palettes. I want to reach for this more often actually, because I did really like this eyeshadow formula. I like how deep this palette goes. I really love the shimmers in this row, and then these deeper mattes are really pretty. They blend really nicely, so I'm gonna keep this one. I'm just gonna try to use it more often because I haven't used it in a couple of years. The Catrice x Iman palette, this one I think I'm gonna declutter. I feel like I have other palettes with this similar color story that I like more. I like most of the shades in here, but this one is definitely my least favorite. I remember it not being very pigmented and just like a little bit chalky. So I am going to declutter this one. This one I'm also going to declutter. This is the NYX Ultimate Shadow Palette. I just never reach for this one because of how colorful it is. I like that this is a mostly matte palette, but a couple of them are more like satin shades, but there aren't any actual like shimmers or metallics in here. These aren't the most pigmented shadows. I do remember that. You do have to build them up, so I'm just gonna declutter this one. I never reach for it. This one is the Makeup Revolution Forever Flawless Unconditional Love palette. The packaging is really pretty. I love this purple marbled packaging, but the shadows in here I don't care for. And I think just the color story in general doesn't inspire me. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this one go. And actually, I think I have one more Makeup Revolution palette, so let me go ahead and grab that. So this is the Emily Edits The Once palette. I used to really like this palette, but over the years, I think I just found other eyeshadow formulas that I like more. And even then, it was never my favorite palette. I just really enjoyed this color story. But a lot of these shimmers are hard to pick up because they did develop hard pan, and some of the mattes can be a little patchy. So I'm gonna go ahead and declutter this one. So these are my Morphe palettes. And actually, let me grab the Jaclyn Hill one because I do have that somewhere around here. I don't think I have any other Morphe ones, but we'll see. Maybe I have a couple more somewhere in the containers, but I'm gonna work on these for now. So this one I'm definitely keeping. This is the original Jaclyn Hill palette before they reformulated it, which I don't understand why they did that. I thought this formula was really good, but I have used this palette countless times. This used to be one of the only palettes that I reached for back when I only had a few palettes. So I am gonna keep it even though I don't use it anymore. I might dip back into it eventually, but this one just has a lot of good memories attached to it, which I will warn you, I think eventually with other palettes that I'm gonna talk about, I am gonna keep mainly for nostalgia or just like good memories. That's just me when it comes to makeup. But this one is one of those palettes. This one, however, I am decluttering. I just didn't like this palette. I was really excited about it because it's very neutral, but it does go pretty deep. Some of the mattes were really patchy on me and the shimmers are really hard pressed. So some of them did develop hard pan already, and it was just a hard palette to work with in general. I really wanted this to work for me, but it just didn't. And then same with these two palettes. This one is the Coca-Cola Morphe Cherry Coke palette. These are some really pretty red and pink shades, but I just don't reach for it. And Morphe's eyeshadow formula for me is very hit or miss. I think I only used this palette maybe once or twice, so I am gonna pass this along. The Madison Beer Channel Surfing Artistry palette. This one I really didn't like. The shimmers were just not good in my opinion. The mattes were fine, but some of the deeper shades irritated my eyes, which is really rare for me. That never happens with eyeshadows, so I'm gonna get rid of this one. This one I am definitely keeping though. This is the Morphe Times Kathleen Lights palette. I know this is super old, but this palette has good memories attached to it, so I don't want to let it go. And I remember just loving this palette. This is definitely one of Morphe's best in my opinion, so I'm gonna keep it even though I never use it, but I'm gonna try to use it one of these days. All right, let's work on these Urban Decay palettes. The Naked Smoky palette. I don't know what it is about this color story that doesn't inspire me. I never knew what looks to do with this palette, so I think for that reason I just never reached for it. So I think it's time to declutter this one. This one I am gonna keep, however. This is the Ultraviolet palette. This packaging is stunning. Definitely one of my favorites from Urban Decay. And honestly, these shadows are fine. They're nothing to write home about, but I have been able to create some really pretty looks with this palette. And I actually really like this shade right here. This is called Lucid. I love this one for an inner corner highlight. It's maybe not the most reflective, but it has a really pretty like duochrome sheen to it. So I am gonna keep this one even though I rarely reach for it, but whenever I do, I end up liking my eyeshadow look, so I'm gonna keep it. Okay, this is definitely a throwback. This is the Urban Decay Born to Run palette, And I remember really liking this palette when I first got it. I really like this color story. I feel like you get a lot of variety in here, so I'm gonna keep this. I'm gonna try to reach for it more often because I haven't used it in a couple of years. For some reason, I thought that this was an Urban Decay palette. I don't know what I was thinking, but these are Urban Decay. So this is the Moondust palette. I honestly don't think I can part with this because I used to love this palette, especially the shade Lithium. I think that was my most reached for shade. I think the shadows are still good. Okay, they don't feel too dry, but these are so pretty. Yeah, I'm gonna keep this one. This one, however, I am decluttering. This is the Electric palette. I don't think they make this anymore, and I think I got this off of Amazon actually, not from Urban Decay or Ulta or Sephora, but it was brand new. I just really wanted to try it, and honestly, I only ended up using it a couple of times because I just don't know what to do with this palette. This is another one of those palettes that I'm always stumped whenever I try to come up with a look. I'm just not the best at coordinating different shades, especially colorful ones. So I'm gonna declutter this. I feel like my makeup skill levels are just not compatible with this palette. This is the Tarte Graveyard Girl Swamp Queen palette. This one I'm honestly never getting rid of because this was a gift from my husband. I remember he took me to Sephora inside JCPenney. I forget for what birthday it was. It might have been for my 25th or 26th birthday. I remember really wanting this palette at the time. He told me to choose whatever I wanted from Sephora, so I got this. It's not the best eyeshadow formula, and the bronzer and blush are pretty intense, maybe like a little bit too pigmented, so I do have to be really careful, but I mainly keep this just for the memories. Hey guys, so I'm editing this video right now and I realized that my camera wasn't recording when I talked about the Sweet Peach palette, which I did end up keeping. It's not a favorite palette or anything, but I still enjoy this color story and I actually used to reach for it a lot. So maybe I'll dip back into it eventually, but I'm keeping it mainly for nostalgia, which I know I've done that with a few palettes. I can't help myself, so I'm gonna keep this one. The Pumpkin Spice palette, I would say the shimmers in here are a little bit better than some of the ones in the Sweet Peach palette, and the mattes are really good as well, so I'm gonna keep this one. And then same with the Cinnamon Swirl palette. Again, the shimmers are really nice, and I actually like this color story, so I'm gonna keep it as well. All right, let's move on to the next container. So here I have my Anastasia Beverly Hills palettes, and then I have some other brands as well. But let's work on the ABH palettes first. The Master Palette by Mario, I'm so glad that I got this because they don't make it anymore. This formula is so good, super easy to work with, and I love that the shimmers are a little bit more satin, like they're not very metallic, so it's just a really easy palette to work with, so I'm definitely keeping it. I am going to keep this one. This is the Carly Bible palette. I think it did get some mixed reviews, but I really enjoyed this one. I thought the formula was really good. I like this color story, and the shimmers in here are very intense. I would say they lean more metallic, so I'm going to keep this one. And actually this one pairs really well with the Norvina palette. I have used these together a couple of times and I really like the way that they work together. I feel like these color stories complement each other really well, especially because of the purple shades, so I'm keeping both. The Modern Renaissance palette, this one I should probably get rid of because it is very old, but I'm gonna keep it for now until I buy a new one. The last time I used it, it worked fine, but it would be good to get a fresh one. But I've hit pan on a couple of the matte shades. This used to be one of my favorite palettes, but I just don't reach for it much anymore, but it's still a really good one. The Soft Glam palette is also a little bit old. Definitely not as old as the Modern Renaissance one, but I should probably get a fresh one anyway. And in this one, I also hit pan on one of the matte shades. Actually, I think both of them have Burnt Orange. Okay, clearly Burnt Orange is one of my most used matte shades because I hit pan in both of these palettes. Again, I'm gonna try to get new ones eventually, just not right now. I'm gonna try to use these more often. This is another one of my most used ABH palettes, the Jackie Aina palette. This color story is one of my all-time favorites, and I would say this is actually one of my all-time favorite palettes as well. I really wouldn't change anything about this, so I'm definitely keeping this one. I haven't reached for it in a while, but this makes me want to do a look with it. This one is a newer favorite of mine from ABH, the Rose Metals palette. I love this packaging, first of all. I love how grungy it looks, and this color story is also super grungy. I've worn this one quite a few times, and especially to concerts or just like going out at night, it's perfect for that because of how bold it is. So of course I'm keeping this one, and I'm also keeping the Nouveau palette. This one I've actually used with the Rose Metals palette. I think they complement each other really well. That matte purple shade, Wisteria, is so pretty. I want to do a one shadow look with that. I don't know why I haven't done that yet, but I love this ABH formula. It's maybe a little bit easier to work with than their traditional formula. So yeah, I'm going to keep both of these. Okay, I finally picked up the Subculture palette. I remember how controversial this palette was. This was so disappointing, like more than I thought it would be. Luckily, it was only $20 at Marshall's. I was somehow able to find one that wasn't broken because all of the other palettes that I checked were shattered, or at least like a couple of the shades would be broken, but this one was fully intact. I just can't stand this formula. It's so hard to work with. A lot of the mattes are very patchy, and the shimmers are fine. The only one that I don't like is Cube. It's just really chalky. I'm gonna declutter this one. Again, this was a very disappointing purchase, but I should have known that. I did see a lot of really bad reviews on this palette when it came out, but I just had to try it for myself and I didn't like it. This one I'm also decluttering. This is the Riviera palette. The shadows in here are fine. There's nothing wrong with this formula. This palette is super colorful, so I never reach for it, but I did use it a few times and I did enjoy it, but I think it's time to pass it along. I'm gonna keep most of these e.l.f. bite-size eyeshadow palettes. The only one I'm decluttering is the Hot Jalapeno one, because I do have shades like this in the e.l.f. times Chipotle palette, so I don't see the point in keeping this one, especially because I don't do green eyeshadow looks ever. Like, it's really rare for me to reach for green eyeshadows, so I'm gonna pass this one along, but I am keeping these three. I have Berry Bad, Truffles, and Pumpkin Pie. Pumpkin Pie is definitely my favorite one. I have used this one so many times. This is just such a good drugstore eyeshadow formula. But yeah, I'm gonna keep all three of these. These two I am keeping. This one is from Natasha Denona. This is the Mini Nude palette. This is newer to me, but I have been loving this palette. It's so easy to work with. It's really good for quick makeup looks. The mattes blend so easily and the shimmers are really intense. And then this one is from M Cosmetics. This is the Divine Skies eyeshadow palette in Rodin. This was one of my most used eyeshadow palettes in 2022. I used it so many times for work. There are only 6 shades in here, so I don't have to think too much about what kind of look I'm gonna do. I'm also keeping the Persona Identity palette. This has been a long-time favorite of mine. I haven't reached for it since maybe late last year, but I do want to use it more often this year. I feel like I'm really close to hitting pan on Charming and Goddess. Those are definitely my 2 most used shades in this palette, but this is just a really good palette overall, so I am keeping it. This is the REM Beauty Baby Doll palette. I really didn't like this one. It's just not very pigmented, so I do have to build up some of these shades quite a bit. So I'm going to declutter this one. I just don't enjoy it. The Lorac Fairy Tale Forest palette. This one, in my opinion, is very underrated. I would say this formula is a little bit easier to work with than their other Pro palette formula. It doesn't have as much kick up and they blend a little bit easier, at least from what I remember. I haven't used a Pro palette in years, but yeah, definitely underrated. If you can still get your hands on it, I would recommend it. The Dose of Colors Friendcation palette. This was a collab with Desi and Katie. I do have to be careful with it because the blue shade did shatter. I don't even remember dropping it. I think just from moving it around. But these are some really pretty glittery metallic shades, and I really like the mattes as well, so I am gonna keep it. I know it's old, but this is such a good palette. The Sigma Corda Rosa palette. This is such a pretty palette. I love this color story. I feel like it's perfect for spring and even summer, or really just year round. You could use this palette any time of the year, but I just feel inspired to use this in the spring and summer. So I'm definitely keeping this one. I am gonna declutter this Rustic Glam palette from Dominique Cosmetics. I'm just not inspired by the color story. I really like that cactus shade, but I think it was a little bit patchy. Some of these matte shades are hard to work with, so I'm gonna declutter this one. This one I am keeping. This is the BH Cosmetics Sweet Shop Cotton Candy palette. I remember they came out with an entire collection. I don't remember how many palettes were in the Sweet Shop collection, but I do regret not having purchased at least a couple of the other ones. I think they had a cherry one and a pistachio one. I think this palette is really well thought out, and the formula is really, really nice, especially for the drugstore. This actually outperforms some of my more expensive colorful palettes. I rarely use it, but I do like to keep it in my collection. And since it has only 8 shades, I don't get overwhelmed when I use this palette. It's really easy for me to come up with looks, so I am keeping this one. I feel like I'm making pretty good progress. So far, I have decluttered quite a few palettes, more than I actually thought I would. So let's move on to the third container. And in this one, I think I have a lot of drugstore palettes. And a lot of like colorful ones as well. All right, let's start off with my Odensai palettes, which I only have 2 of right now. I am waiting on the new Sea Talk palette from the Lauren Mae Beauty collab. I am so excited to get that one in the mail today. I'm pretty sure I'm getting it today. But for now, I do have these 2 right here, and I am gonna keep both. This one is the Red Dragon palette. And this is honestly one of my favorite palettes in my collection. Unfortunately, it was limited edition, so you can't get it anymore. But I am so glad that I got this when I did. Look at this color story. It is stunning. I love that the packaging is like a book. I thought it was such a nice touch. But these shimmers are some of the best that I've ever tried. And the mattes are really nice and pigmented, super easy to blend. Even some of the deeper shades. Overall, this is just a really well thought out palette, so I'm definitely keeping this one. And same with the Hella palette by Angelica. Even though I don't reach for these kinds of shades often, I like having them in my collection, especially because the formula is so good. I like that this one and the Red Dragon palette has some duochromes, because I don't have a lot of duochromes in my collection, but this shade River is definitely my favorite in the entire palette. But overall, it's just such a good palette. The Pure Times Raw Beauty Christie palette, I'm gonna keep this one, even though I don't reach for the colorful side. I honestly don't know what to do with the shadows in here, but I'm gonna keep it mainly because, of course, it's Raw Beauty Christie. I have been watching her for years. The only shade I really use in here is Cafe Disco. I do like this side though, even though I don't use it often, but I really like the mustard tones in here. And you also get a mauve shade and a coral shade, so I'm gonna keep this one. I'm gonna declutter this one. This is the Alamar Cosmetics Reina del Caribe Volume 1 palette. I did enjoy it when I first bought this, but I didn't reach for it often after that. The color story is really pretty, but it's not a favorite of mine, and I'm pretty sure they reformulated it. I could be mistaken, but it might be better now. Not that there was anything really wrong with it. It just never became a favorite. So I'm going to declutter this one. This one I'm also getting rid of. This is the BH Cosmetics Daisy Marquez palette. I never liked this palette because it's really dusty and you get so much fallout. A lot of the shimmers just wouldn't stick to my lids. They would fade really quickly. But this color story I didn't really care for. So I'm going to go ahead and declutter this one. I have a few palettes from Milani. These are pretty old, and I really only reached for this one. This one is Earthy Elements. I did use this one quite a bit, but I haven't used it in years. This blue one is called Smoky Essentials. I think I reached for this maybe once. I just don't reach for shades like this. And then this purple one is Plum Basics, another one that I rarely reached for. So I am going to declutter all three of these. And then these are my Juvia's Place palettes, which I don't reach for often. Some of these are very colorful, so I think that's why. But this one, I think, has been my most used palette out of the four. This is the Saharan. Yeah, I've definitely used this bronzy shade quite a bit, and I love the warm tones in here. So I'm gonna keep this one. This one is the Zulu palette. Oh yeah, this one is super colorful. I think I'm gonna declutter this one. This might be one of my least used Juvia's Place palettes. This one is the Masquerade palette. I like that this one is a half colorful palette and then the other half is more neutral. So I've definitely used the bottom two rows the most, but I'm gonna keep this one because I do really like a lot of the shades in here. And then finally, the Magic palette. This is another one that I rarely use, so I think I'm gonna declutter this one as well. This BH Cosmetics Carly Bible palette is bringing back so many memories. I used to love this palette. The eyeshadows are fine, but I especially love the highlighters, especially the bottom left side. The right side is a little bit too deep for me, but I do like to mix a few of the shades in here, so I'm gonna keep this one. I'm also keeping the Tati Beauty palette. Unfortunately, Tati Beauty is no longer a brand. This is a really fun palette, but I especially love the glitters in here. I think that's what really stands out in this palette. I've really enjoyed this one, so I am gonna keep it. Okay, this one I'm honestly only keeping because of the packaging. I don't like the shadows in here. Let me just say that. They're just not very pigmented. And the way that the shadows are laid out makes it really hard to come up with different looks. Like when I look at this, I have no idea what to do with it. I think this is supposed to be like stained glass inspired or something like that, which is a really cool idea. But yeah, the quality of the shadows is not good in my opinion. I really only keep this on display on top of my IKEA Alex drawers where I keep my makeup. So that is where it's gonna continue to be. I'm gonna declutter this JCat Beauty Sunset Boulevard palette. I used to like this one, but it's not the kind of formula that I like anymore. The shimmers are really like thick, if that makes any sense. So they do look really heavy on the lids. And the mattes were nice. They're really nice and pigmented, but I just don't like this palette anymore. And it also broke, so I'm gonna declutter it. I'm also getting rid of this Morphe palette. This is the 35M Boss Mood palette. I used to like this one as well, especially for Halloween. I don't know what it is about this palette that screams Halloween to me, so I did mainly use it for that. It has some really interesting green shades in here, a lot of like mossy shades, but you also get some purples, reds, and a couple of bronzy shades. But I just don't use it anymore. I am not a fan of this formula anymore, so I'm gonna declutter it. I'm gonna keep this one. This is the Kesha Rose palette from Hip Dot. I don't know why when I bought this, I thought she was gonna come out with her own brand, but I'm pretty sure this was a collab with Hip Dot. It wasn't necessarily a brand that she was coming out with, but I mainly bought this because of the packaging, because look at how stunning this is. I haven't seen anything like this. I don't love the way that these shades are laid out. It does feel a little bit chaotic to me, but I do remember liking the ones that I tried. So I'm gonna keep it. I'm gonna try it a few more times and see how I feel about it, but I might declutter it eventually, so I'm gonna keep it for now. And then this is the MAC Selena palette. I remember doing a first impressions on this palette a few years ago, and I used it a few times after that, but I haven't reached for it since. But I'm still gonna keep it because I am a fan of Selena. It's not a favorite palette or anything, but I have enjoyed it, and I definitely want to use it more often because this shade in particular is super pretty. I would say that is my favorite shade in the palette, so I'm gonna keep it. So we're down to the last two boxes. I'm gonna go through my ColourPop palettes first. So let's work on those. I feel like this is gonna be one of the hardest parts of the declutter for me. I don't know what it is, but I love trying new ColourPop palettes. They just have a special place in my heart. I love a lot of their themes, a lot of their packaging. Some of them are very hit or miss, but I still like trying them. I went ahead and zoomed in a little bit more. Hopefully that's better. I probably should have done that earlier, but let's start with the Going Coconuts palette. I'm going to keep this one. I really enjoy it. The shimmers get a little bit messy, but I don't mind because they look so pretty on the lids. And I love the mattes in here as well, so I'm keeping this one. This one I really want to keep, but being realistic, I never reach for it. This is the Mint to Be palette. I think I've used this literally once or twice. I really want to keep it though. I feel like this would be perfect for spring. So let me keep it for now, and I'll see eventually if I want to declutter it, but I want to get some use out of it before I do that. The Aha Honey palette, I never loved this one. I know it was super popular at one point, but I feel like these tones are not very flattering on me. And overall, I just don't reach for a lot of yellow shades. So I'm going to declutter this one. And then this one I also didn't care for. This is the Main Squeeze palette. I love the red and plummy tones in here, but I don't love this formula. And same with the Aha Honey palette. I didn't like it very much, so I'm going to declutter this one. I have 3 Star Wars palettes, and I'm going to keep all 3. This one is the Mandalorian palette. I love this one because it's really like grungy. This palette feels really cohesive to me, so I'm going to keep this one. I also love this Mandalorian The Child palette. Look at how adorable that is. Like, how can you not love Baby Yoda? This one actually pairs really well with the Mandalorian palette, so let me show you how they look side by side. I've used these together before and they do pair really nicely, so I'm gonna keep both. I just feel like in general, the Star Wars palettes are really well thought out. The packaging is not only nice, but the shadows are really good quality as well. And then this one is the Darth Vader palette. This one I'm also keeping, and especially because my sister Izzy gave it to me. It wasn't even for a special occasion. She just gave it to me just because. She's just really thoughtful like that. So shout out to my sister Izzy. But I really like this color story. I had planned on purchasing it anyway, but then she gave it to me. So I'm really glad that I have this in my collection. Super grungy, very cool toned, but it's actually very flattering on me. So I'm going to keep all 3 of these Star Wars palettes. This one I like to keep in the box just because it looks like a Valentine's Day card. I am going to keep this one because I really like this color story. The shimmers are very messy. I definitely have to do my eyes first, but they do apply nicely. And especially because I didn't purchase this year's Valentine's Day palette, I want to have at least one Valentine's Day themed palette in my collection, so I'm going to keep it. I'm also keeping this Hello Kitty and Friends palette. This is just adorable, and I love anything Hello Kitty, so I'm keeping it mainly because of that, but the shades in here are actually really pretty. Nothing special in my opinion, but I do really enjoy it, so I'm gonna keep it. This one I think I'm getting rid of. This is the Grandeur palette. I love the packaging, but I feel like I have shades like this in other ColourPop palettes, so I'm gonna declutter this one. I am keeping this one, however. This is the That's Taupe palette. Even though this one is more cool toned than what I normally reach for, I do really enjoy it. I already know that I'm keeping both of these. This one is the Hocus Pocus palette. I wasn't a fan of the other Hocus Pocus palette, or I think they have 2 actually after this, but this one I definitely really like. Not just the packaging, but I love the shades in here. I love how grungy it is, and I like the plummy and purple tones. You also get some greens, so I'm gonna keep this one. And then this one is the Misunderstood Disney Villains palette. I think what stands out to me the most in this palette is the shimmers. The mattes are nice as well, but I reach for this palette mainly because of the shimmers. I like the variety that you get in here. And then these are my bigger ColourPop palettes. This one is the It's a Mood palette. I haven't used this one often, to be honest. I think just bigger palettes in general are not something that I reach for as often as I used to. I tend to get really overwhelmed when I have so many shades available in a palette, but I do want to keep trying this one. I've only used a couple of rows in here, so I want to try some of the other ones, but I love the tones in here. This is a very like fall palette. And then this one is the So Jaded palette from Kathleen Lights. This one is definitely jewel toned. My favorite shade is definitely Diamond, which is a Super Shock shadow. I really wish they would have come out with this as an individual Super Shock shadow, but for some reason they never did. This one is a little bit dried out, but I feel like I can still make it work. Look at how pretty that is. But this formula is really nice. I do enjoy creating different looks with it, so I'm gonna keep it. I am keeping this one. This is the Avatar: The Last Airbender palette. Not just because of the packaging, which I think is really pretty, but the actual shades in here are super nice. I love the way that these shades are laid out. It makes it really easy to create different looks. This was actually one of the only palettes that I had in my everyday makeup bag when I moved last year. So this was pretty much the only one that I reached for the first like month after I moved in. So this does have some memories attached to it. And yeah, besides that, I really like the shades in here. I'm gonna declutter this So Very Lovely palette. I just don't reach for it often, especially compared to some of my other ColourPop palettes. It's not a bad palette, but some of the shimmers are really messy. And actually this purple shade, which is called Macaroon, this one looks really similar to the one in the ABH Nouveau palette. I might have to compare those later on, but it's such a pretty shade. The one from the Nouveau palette is definitely better than this one. So I am going to declutter this one. I feel like I have a lot of these shades in other palettes. I honestly don't think I can get rid of this one because I was such a huge Lizzie McGuire fan. But this is the What Dreams Are Made Of palette. So I'm keeping this mainly because of nostalgia, but these shades are really pretty. Not something that I reach for often, but maybe in the summer I could get more use out of it, so I'm gonna keep it. The California Love palette, this one I'm keeping as well. This is one of my favorite palettes from ColourPop. This to me is a very summer transitioning into fall palette. I don't know why, but it just gives me that vibe. But these are my kinds of shades. Super bronzy, a little bit of like mustard tones in there, and that deeper red shade. Oh, hey, Barbara. This is one of my favorite ColourPop palettes, so I am gonna keep it. I'm also keeping this at Forest Sight palette from the Raw Beauty Christie collab. And this palette is super fall themed in my opinion. I actually love that you get mostly mattes in here. I love pairing this with my Super Shock shadows, especially the ones from her collab, but these tones are so rich and I just love this formula, so I'm gonna keep it. This one, for some reason, I haven't given much of a chance, but I definitely need to use it more. This is the Lush Life palette. These shades are so intense. I remember loving this formula because it's really pigmented and definitely one of ColourPop's best. So I'm gonna keep this one and try to use it more often. I also love this Limoncello palette. They came out with a few other items in the collection, but I didn't like them. I think they came out with some shadow sticks and stick blushes, but these shadows blend so nicely. I love the shimmers in here. It's just a very cohesive palette, so I am keeping it. Okay, I was really tempted to keep this, but I think I am going to declutter it. This is the Dream Street palette from Kathleen Lights. I don't love this color story anymore, even though it does have some really pretty shades. I just don't see myself reaching for it anymore. So I think it's time to let go of this, as much as it hurts, because I do love Kathleen Lights. But yeah, I think I'm going to let this one go. I'm kind of surprised that I'm considering decluttering this palette. I didn't think that I would because it is Sailor Moon and I love the packaging. The two shimmers in the middle were pretty dried out when I first got this. And besides that, I just don't love the shades in here. So as much as I want to keep it, I'd rather pass it along. Maybe somebody else would enjoy it. And then the last ColourPop palette in my collection is the I Love Sarai Through My Eyes palette. So this one I had thought about decluttering, but I think I am going to keep it. I just really like this color story and I do see myself reaching for it eventually. Maybe I'll do a few more looks with it and see if I want to declutter it in the future. But for now, I am going to keep it. I did change my mind. So those were all of my ColourPop palettes. I honestly got rid of more than I thought I would. I thought I was going to keep almost all of them, but I feel like I made pretty good progress. So let's move on to the final box of palettes that I have. So a lot of these are more high-end and luxury palettes, but I do have a few single shadows in here as well. So let's go through these really quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on them because they're not actual palettes. I have a few single shadows in here that are mainly from ColourPop. And I think I have a couple of Makeup Geek shadows. And then this one is from Urban Decay. I'm gonna have to go through my single shadows eventually off camera. But right away, I do see a couple of shadows in here that I'm probably gonna declutter just because I don't use them anymore. But I would say this is mainly a face palette for me. I do use my Essence Brighten Up Banana Powder all of the time. And then these two blushes are from the Kathleen Lights ColourPop collection. This one I don't use often, but this is a Wet n Wild highlighter in the shade Golden Flower Crown. I do keep this on my filming desk, so I'm gonna continue to store it over there. And then this is where I keep most of my single shadows. These are all of the newer Makeup Geek shadows. I got these all on sale actually because they did go out of business, which is unfortunate. And then a lot of these are the older Makeup Geek shadows. I also have some of the newer shimmers up here. And I think this one is from Urban Decay. This one is from ColourPop. So yeah, I do reach for these every once in a while. Not as often as my actual palettes, but I like to keep this one on my filming desk. So I'm gonna keep it over there. These are my Huda Beauty palettes. I do have 4 of them. I wasn't very impressed with this one. This is the Empowered palette. I got this during the Sephora VIB sale last year. I think it was the one towards the end of the year. So I'm glad that I got this at a discount because I don't love this palette. I don't like that the deepest shadows in here are cream shadows, especially because I don't like that cream shadow formula. It's very sheer and a little too waxy for me. And then some of the shimmers in here are just really flaky. I don't know, I feel like I have to keep playing with this palette because the mattes in here are pretty good, but as a whole, this palette didn't really do it for me. But I'm still gonna keep it. I'm gonna try to use it a few more times and then maybe declutter it in the future. The Rose Quartz palette, however, this is one of my favorite Huda Beauty palettes. Actually, it might be my #1 favorite palette from Huda Beauty, so I'm definitely keeping this one. I love the purples and the mauve shades in here. The only shade I don't like, however, is that middle balmy shade, which is called Lovestone. I just don't get why they put that formula in there. But besides that, I really like this palette, so I am keeping it. This one I also really like. I just haven't used it as much as some of my other Huda Beauty palettes. But this is the Mercury Retrograde palette. I love this color story for spring, so I'm really looking forward to using it more often. And then the Naughty Nude palette. I do really enjoy this palette. I definitely prefer the Rose Quartz palette, however, but I actually think this complements that one really nicely. I have used them together, so I'm gonna keep this one as well. I love the red shades in here, and you also get some plummy tones. Again, I don't like that balmy shade in here. This one is called Slippery, but I still enjoy it, so I'm gonna keep it. So basically, I'm keeping all 4 of my Huda Beauty palettes, at least for now. I feel like the only one I might declutter in the future is the Empowered one. Okay, I think it's time to declutter this one. This is the Baked Browns palette from Dose of Colors. I used to really love this one, but for some reason, the shadows in here broke on me so easily, especially the first shade. That one is completely missing from this palette because it shattered. I did repress the second matte shade, and same with the third one. This is a really nice all matte palette, but I think they did either reformulate it or change the packaging, so I might just pick up a new one in the future. But for now, I'm gonna declutter this one. Okay, so I had to switch over to my iPhone because the memory card on my camera got full, but luckily I only have a few palettes left to go through. And honestly, I think I'm only gonna declutter one of these because I love all of these palettes except for this one. This one is the Pat McGrath Labs Subversive Eyeshadow Palette. And this one I just don't enjoy because I don't like the shades in here. I probably have to use a glitter glue with these metallics to really make them pop, but without one, I felt like they were a little lackluster, especially for Pat McGrath. So I'm gonna declutter this one. I just don't use it. The rest of these, however, I am keeping. This one is the Mothership 5, I believe. This was the first Pat McGrath palette that I ever tried, and this was a gift from my sister-in-law Flor. So thank you to her for gifting me this palette because I've really enjoyed it over the years. This is the palette that made me a fan of Pat McGrath shadows, so I'm definitely keeping this one. And then this one is the Mothership Utopian palette. I really don't use this one enough, but the shades in here are some of my favorite from Pat McGrath. It's a very like spring palette to me, so I'm definitely going to be using it a lot this spring, but I love this one year round anyway. And then finally this one, this is the Venus and Fleurs Luxe Quad in Voyeuristic Vixen. This is definitely one of my most used Pat McGrath palettes. There's only one matte shade in here, so I do like to bring in other matte shades from other palettes, but overall it's just a really fun palette. And then these are my 3 Natasha Denona palettes. This one I got on sale. This is the Sunset palette. Luckily I got it on sale for, I believe, $60 or less, which was a really good deal, but I'm really glad that I got it. This is the only bigger palette from Natasha Denona that I've tried, but I love the bronzy tones in here, and you do get a matte yellow shade, which I haven't played with yet, but I definitely need to try that one, so I'm definitely keeping this one. But I would say the retro palette is my favorite from Natasha Denona. I just love the pinks in here. I love that you also get some reds, some plummy tones. I really love this palette for date nights. And then the My Dream palette, I've also really been enjoying this one. This one pairs really well with the retro palette. These color stories complement each other really well. The Il Makiage Kathleen Lights palette, this was actually my first Il Makiage purchase, and I was really impressed with the quality of this palette. I know it was a little bit pricier, but it was definitely worth it in my opinion. These mattes are the definition of buttery matte eyeshadows, and the shimmers are really nice as well. This is definitely my most used shimmer in the palette. It's like a taupey bronzy shade. I love this one all over the lids. Definitely one of my favorite palettes from 2022. And then finally we have the Patrick Ta Major Dimension palettes. I like both of these, but I definitely prefer the Major Dimension 2. I feel like he improved the formula in this one, and I just prefer the shades in here. This was one of my most used palettes in 2022. I still like the first one, but I do reach for the second one the most, and this one is a lot more bronzy. I also love using the cream shadows as eyeshadow primers. So I counted 36 palettes total that I decluttered, which is not bad. I honestly thought I was gonna get rid of less. I thought it was going to be harder for me to part ways with some of these palettes. I probably could have gotten rid of a few more, but I'm going to give some of them a chance before I decide to fully part ways with them. So that means I'm keeping about 74 palettes because I did have 110 total. But that is it for me, you guys. I really hope you enjoyed part 3 in my declutter series. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.